Good morning, everybody, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us for our ethics forum. This is the Women's Health Global Ethics Forum, sponsored by Strength and Serenity, the Mass General Hospital program to end gender-based violence. And I'm really excited to have you all here and to reflect on this very weighty issue, which is the issue of agency for medical choices and reproductive health choices for women. And it's entitled, Who Owns That Body? I want to start, first of all, by thanking the people who made this program happen, and most definitely thanking my program coordinator, Mary Greenwald. This would not have happened without Mary's amazing commitment and thoughtfulness. And I also want to thank the participants for being here and to thank our panelists. And we will go through introducing everyone. But I wanted to start by sharing my screen and just giving a few words of introduction to sort of contextualize why we're here and why we're talking about this. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen. And Scott, you can let me know if that's working. Can you all see my screen? I assume you can. Yes? Okay, so here we go. So just to start with this, in terms of who owns that body. And I want to start by saying that this whole topic came up from a very thoughtful and compelling Notes from the Field, which is the sort of core writing of our monthly newsletter by a physician from Saudi Arabia. And she talked about a patient she took care of who was a 24-year-old single woman brought by her family to the emergency room with vaginal bleeding and pain. They did an ultrasound, they did labs. She had a large mass in the cervix uterus area. She had renal failure, kidney failure. She had a blocked ureters, and her family refused to allow a pelvic exam to get a biopsy and to further evaluate what happened. This woman ended up dying from an untreated advanced cervical cancer. This question led me to ask, and led us all to ask, why did this 24-year-old not have agency to make choices about her body? And the outcome from that lack of agency, for very complicated reasons, led to her death at her very young age. And so who does own that body? Who has the responsibility to guide care and make choices? Is it the woman? Is it her husband when she's married? Is it the family, her parents, society, the medical establishment? Where does that come from? It's very, very complicated. And I would say that there's no one binary answer to this. Framing it within the sort of social ecological model, which is a public health concept of all these various layers, helps me to try and understand the various components. So in that model, you have the individual with whatever they are, how they grew up, their education, their beliefs, their religious background, their affiliations. There's the interpersonal, which is the family. What are the influences of the family, the friends, the social networks? Then you have the community that surrounds them, the church, the school, the local government, the various norms of culture. And then you have the overarching political laws of the country, and then perhaps globally, even the world. And I believe all of that goes into what is required to give agency to people, to guide them, and ultimately to medical outcomes. There are many, many barriers to medical care. Agency is one of them, but there's many others that are complicated and maybe are part of how decision-making has happened. And I've listed them here. There's financial, there's lack of the ability to get to an institution. There's language barriers, educational barriers, discrimination, lack of services, and then finally, lack of resources from the medical side. All these go together. I've been blessed for the past 15 years to work in Bangladesh, consulting and developing infrastructure for cancer care for women. And prior to the pandemic, I had the opportunity to be in Cox's Bazar, which is well-known because that's where the largest refugee camp in the world is for the Rohingyas. But we were in a small clinic there, and a 15-year-old girl was brought in, young woman, by her husband and her mother-in-law. She had been laboring at home for the past 5 days, and there was no baby coming out, so her family brought her in. She was clearly very sick, very exhausted, and on examination, she had a very concerning fetal heart rate consistent with a dying fetus. The physician on call recommended urgently a cesarean section. Her husband refused, and they took this girl home. And that was it. What happened there? Clearly she went home to die. So the question is, what did we just see there? What did we witness? Who decides the medical care? What were the complexities to those issues that made the husband and the mother-in-law decide they were not going to undergo a C-section? By the way, they would have had to pay for that C-section. Where was the voice of this patient? Is this a form of gender-based violence? How does that all work? So with that in mind, with those contextual stories, what is bodily autonomy and why is it so important? It's the power to make choices about one's own body without facing violence, without facing coercion. And in the context of women's sexual and reproductive health, it's the power to make decisions about healthcare, about your future, and about even surviving and staying alive. And the extent to which women can exercise that right really affects everything and ultimately impacts our society. So, why are women deprived of that ability to have autonomy? Where does that come from? I brought up the sort of social ecologic model in patriarchal communities. Women's bodies have historically been regarded as property. Therefore, they don't have agency in that way. And that, ownership control takes the guise of cultural norms, religious mores, social constructs, very, very complicated, and so many places at play here. And ultimately, another concept that probably is very important is the whole concept of structural violence. This was really put on the map by Paul Farmer, but it was first described in 1969 by Johann Galtung as some social structure or institution that may harm people by preventing them from meeting their basic needs. And I've listed the examples here: racism, elitism, nationalism, sexism. It's really an avoidable impairment of fundamental human needs, but it is so embedded in society that we assume it's normative and part of just our normal environment. It's very linked to social injustice, and it is directly interdependent with other forms of violence, such as family violence, sexual violence, gender violence, hate crimes, state violence, terrorism, war. It's very interconnected. So how are women deprived of bodily autonomy? There's many, many ways that we see it. I've listed them here. And again, I want to thank Mary for putting this list together. Access to reproductive choice, anti-abortion laws, chastity laws, female genital mutilation, forced early marriage, child marriage, honor killings, trafficking, various things, hijab laws, criminalizing transgender care. All these things affect us. And we are facing in this current time a barrage attacks against women around the world and here in the United States. We have multiple examples. The US Supreme Court overturn of Roe v. Wade has led to multiple states coming down with restrictive abortion laws, reducing access to appropriate reproductive health care for women. Sexual violence is used worldwide in wars and in oppression. And I've listed some examples: Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Sudan. We see this at our border with Mexico, with disappearances, kidnapping, sexual assault of women as they migrate. And another terrible example, the murder of Mahsa Amini at the hands of the Iranian morality police. So many examples. Ultimately, the the barriers to agency, decisions of reproductive choice, the ability to make your own medical decisions leads to medical outcomes and poor medical outcomes. Worldwide, there is mortality as the final outcome, whether it's from cancer, from dying in childbirth, from infection, whatever it is that happens without access to healthcare. And clearly, depending on where you live and the resources, as you see in this world mapper, it will be different. So ultimately, medical decision-making power leads to the ability to have good outcomes. It's linked to social ecologic model. And ultimately, healthcare providers, patients, families, and society need to put this all together and think about this deeply. With that in mind, I want to turn this over to our wonderful moderator, Charlene Galarno. She's a senior lecturer at Harvard Medical School and in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, and she's a bioethics guru. And I'm very, very excited to have her and turning this over to her. Thank you so much.
Thank you, AK. That was very generous of you. So I kind of have a dual role here as moderator and also as a commentator. So I get to say a few things. So let me begin there. But before we move to our panelists, but let me also invite those of you in the audience, if you wish to submit questions, please do that to the Q&A function, not to the chat. And we'll get to as many of those as we can in a bit. So I have two comments to start. One is, first, I really just want to lift up and highlight, if you will, some of the ethical issues that AK raised so far and that we will be deepening and adding to as we go on. So violence as an ethical issue, both direct violence and structural, which she mentioned. Power. Now, both of those are things that aren't often attended to very strongly in bioethics, at least as it typically is done here in the United States. But then agency and choice and autonomy, those we do hear much more about. So let me just say a little bit about autonomy. So it is often represented as one of, if not the most important ethical principle in Western bioethics, particularly in the US. And it's commonly understood as sort of patient self-determination, freedom from interference in decision-making, and often framed as a right. And we could talk for a long time about the meaning of a right, but a right to autonomy. But I think this rendering of autonomy is actually morally stunted in a couple of ways. In the first, it tends to obscure the correlative responsibilities or obligations that rights imply. So to have a right to autonomy suggests to me that we also have an obligation to respect that autonomy. This is the ethical principle, right, that in practice underlies informed consent. Informed consent was created to operationalize respect for autonomy. But that sense of an obligation to respect autonomy has often been lost in bioethics discourse. And then secondly, the notion of respect for autonomy is, I think, a rather narrow and impoverished version of a fuller ethical principle, which is respect for persons. Right? An obligation to respect persons and not just their autonomy, right, is grounded in this notion that all human beings have fundamental dignity and moral worth, right? And this idea of an obligation to respect persons and not just their autonomy might be useful to us later on. So much more is going to be said about autonomy. So let's move to our panelists. And we are very privileged today to have three persons who have given considerable thought to these questions. I'll introduce each very briefly so that we have more time to hear from each of them directly. And there are fuller biographies were found in your Zoom invitation, but also in the chat. So starting us off will be Dr. Anita Superson, a philosopher at the University of Kentucky in the United States who works in ethics and feminism. She'll be followed by our second philosopher, Dr. Sarah Cohen-Chabot of the University of Haifa in Israel, with her work on obstetric violence as gender violence. And then we'll move to Dr. Michelle Sandler, a Chilean activist and anthropologist at the University Adolfo Ibáñez and the director of the Chilean Observatory of Obstetric Violence. So each panelist will have 15 minutes. Then I'll make a few brief comments with a question or two for our panelists, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So again, if you have them, please post them to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So let us begin with Anita. Super sweet.
Okay, thanks, Charlene. Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and thanks, Mary and AK, for putting this together. I have a lot to say, and I try to truncate things as much as I could, but philosophers are notorious for going on and on and on. So maybe save it for Q&A if you have something. So I thought I would start with this quote from Judith Jarvis Thomson, and she has a very famous paper, arguably the most famous paper in philosophy, where she does talk about the right to bodily autonomy. And she's not a feminist, or doesn't say she is in this paper. It's an old paper, it goes back to 71. And she says, my own view is that if a human being has any just prior claim to anything at all, he has a just prior claim to his own body. So philosophers want to know, like, can you defend this? And she really doesn't in her paper. The paper is about abortion rights. And she's talking about three cases: case of rape, case where the mother's life is at stake, and the case of contraceptive failure. And it's a very fun paper to read. She gives these wildly outlandish analogies. And she just sort of takes it that this is a right that we don't really need to defend. It's just something that, it's just fundamental about us. And she understands it to be a right to determine what happens in and to your body. So like some people say, oh gosh, if we give people a right to bodily autonomy, it means they get to do what they want with their body. And she doesn't say that. So I think a lot of people want to say, let's keep it to this. Okay, so part two, Scott. So being a philosopher, let's try to give some kind of defense. We got some kind of defense of the right to bodily autonomy. Eventually, want to write a book on this. So these are just some ideas I'm just throwing out there right now, and I want to say a lot more about them in the future. So one thing we can just say is, well, look, we're housed in our bodies. Your person is not separate from your body, throughout your whole life. That's a thing philosophers worry about, separation of mind and body, but you guys as physicians probably never think about that. You come into this world and you go out of it with your own body, and you are alone in these events, even if you're surrounded by other people. Your body is the vehicle through which you live your whole life. You feel pain and pleasure through it. And our bodies and our minds together shape who we are. Because you are, or even own your body. So there's like talk in literature, do you own your own body, or you just are your body? Like what is that relation between you and your body? You have a just prior claim to it, and you are the only one who can allow someone else to use your body. So this is like one of the fundamental claims that Thompson brings out in her article. Any attack on your body is an attack on yourself, since yourself is housed in your body. So it's not just that there's something bad happening to your body, it's something bad happening to your whole person, as it were. An attack on your body is an attack on your personal agency. And I think that's something that you need to see yourself as a valid member of a moral community, a being who is owed certain treatment, including respect for her body. So respect, and dignity, as Charlene was mentioning. We tend to think that when moral obligations involve the use of our bodies, these demands become less stringent than when they do not. So in fact, we say the more intimately our bodies must be used in fulfilling some moral obligation, we tend to think that the less stringent the demands come. So for example, if do you have an obligation to interfere with somebody who's being murdered on the street? Do you have to go out there and like use your body to defend that person? Or do you have an obligation just to call 911? Do you have an obligation to donate blood? How about bone marrow? How about getting a vaccine? It seems like the more intimately your body gets involved, the less stringent the demand. At least that's the way we kind of think of it in our country. We think the right to bodily autonomy is significant because we appeal to it in issues like rape, abortion, battery, female genital mutilation, fetal harm, etc. So if we give up the right to bodily autonomy in healthcare cases, we're going to lose it for these other cases. So there's a lot at stake in trying to defend it and, you know, respect it all the way around. So we ask, what is autonomy? What is bodily autonomy? So we think of autonomy as Charlene was saying, self-direction, self-determination. That's usually equated with the satisfaction of your desires and preferences. So some people think, well, bodily autonomy then is just worrying about preferences and desires about your own body. And so if you get to be self-determining about those preferences and desires, then you have bodily autonomy. I think it's just a little more complicated. It's all of your interests sort of attached to you, and your person is housed in your body. So it's not just like your interests at stake, but it's like bodily integrity. It's something deeper. And that's something you have in virtue of all of your interests being interests of you as a person. So I like to think of this in terms of the example of rape. So rape is not really like bad because we're ignoring or discounting or thwarting your interests about your body, but it's a violation of your very person through your body. So it's a violation of your bodily integrity. It's an act. It's not an act that just goes against like some interest you have about your body and how your body gets treated, but it's about how your whole person is treated. So it sends a message that you are the kind of person who whose interests, any and all of those interests just don't count. Okay. So that's just some ideas of maybe how we can tweak out a defense of the right to bodily autonomy. So the other question is, who has a right to bodily autonomy? Well, in our country, it seems to be pretty readily granted to males, but not to women. So some examples of that were already mentioned, like rape in marriage. It was a legal statute that was finally repealed in the United States in 1993 that denied the existence of rape by a wife by a husband. It used to be that, you know, it was okay for a husband to rape his wife. Fetal harm cases of forced cesarean section. Really good article by Janet Gallagher that, you know, gives you all these legal cases, but there was one where a hospital administrator, this is in 1984 in Chicago, a hospital administrator got a court order authorizing a C-section for a Nigerian woman delivering triplets. She was cuffed to the bed and her husband forcibly removed from the hospital. 1986, San Diego, a woman was arrested and jailed for 6 days on charges of medical neglect for her fetus. She ingested street drugs, had sex with her husband, and failed to report promptly to the hospital, and she began bleeding. And no one thought anything of this about, you know, incarcerating this woman. Abortion restrictions. That was already mentioned, the overturning of Roe versus Wade. There's at least 24 states that have banned or are likely to ban abortion. I think that number's up from when I read this. There's trigger bans in effect. And if you look at it, there's only a handful of states, mostly in the West Coast and the Northeast Coast, and Illinois and Minnesota have protected and actually expanded access, and they put it in their state constitution. Another case, Dubé versus Wells, is from 2007. This guy, Matthew Dubé, his girlfriend became pregnant after they had sex, and she did not want an abortion, and he didn't want to be a father. And so he wanted to enforce abortion on her. She gave birth to a baby girl in 2005. And she got a court order for him to pay child support, but he went to the National Center for Men who appealed and said that he didn't want to be a father. And so they were trying to get control of abortion rights in both directions, like a woman can or can't have an abortion, gets to be decided by the man. It's not an uncommon belief. Finally, it's not a legal case, but it goes up in lots of legal cases that if a woman engages in some kind of sexual behavior, then she contracts to having sex. Okay, and so these are cases of women. You can compare them to some cases of men. Here's a case where they thought here was a guy was shot and they needed the bullet for evidence. And they thought, no, we can't get that bullet out because using general anesthesia is like too demeaning. It's like too much of an interference with this person's bodily autonomy. And then there was another case where a judge said, no, we can't force somebody to give bone marrow, male. We can't force him to give bone marrow to his cousin because that would be too much of an intrusion on his body. Okay, so what grounds the distinction between the social and legal treatment of male and female body? I'm just going to say it's sexism, plain and simple. And if we're going to grant males the right to bodily autonomy, I don't see why, since women are persons too, why we shouldn't be granting the same thing when it comes to women. Okay, so this raises this other question and people worry about, is the right to bodily autonomy universal or relative? Well, if we shouldn't make any distinctions on the basis of gender, I'm going to say we shouldn't make a distinction on the basis of geography. It's a basic human right. It's a universal right. It's just not being respected. So the 15-year-old from Bangladesh in the case, I think, has the right to bodily autonomy, but it wasn't being respected. Okay, well, people worry about universalism. This seems to be something my students always bring up. I don't want to judge anybody from another culture. Like, I want to be hands off. Okay, but I want to dispel a few myths about moral relativism. It's just the view that says moral truths are relative to culture. Okay, it doesn't say anything about judging. So you could be a moral relativist, have it as part of your moral code that it's okay to judge other people, other cultures. So that's just wrong about the judging thing. And we also need to make sense of feminist claims that are like universal, where we say like women are oppressed, oppression is bad, women have equal human dignity to men. Those are the only way to make sense of those is in a universalist framework. And then we can also say some practices are just objectively bad and point to, medical or psychological or social reasons why those practices are bad. Okay, and then lastly, some factors impeding bodily autonomy. Some of these were mentioned, like lack of information, external, internal pressures. I just wanted to skip over to deformed desires. So oppressive socialization is a thing that feminist philosophers have talked a lot about, and how this affects somebody's, the formation of their beliefs and desires. So there's this idea of deformed desires or adaptive preferences. And here's a good way to explain it. It's called a sour grapes phenomenon. So you have a fox who likes grapes and he eats them all the time. You move the grapes out of the fox's reach, and the fox adapts its preferences. So it's not going to starve to death. It's just going to come to prefer to eat something else and not to prefer to eat the grapes. And the same thing kind of goes on with women. If you deny their opportunities, they come to change their preferences just so that they can be satisfied. So if they want to, start out wanting to be a doctor and you give them all this stuff like, oh no, girls are not good at math, blah, blah, blah. They will adapt their preferences and have different desires, whether or not they're aware of them. So there's lots of features of deformed desires. It's hard to even know if you've got one. I think I have a bunch of them. I think everybody has them, but some basic things are they're formed in response to unjust social conditions. When we think of typical desires, we think when you satisfy them, you're the person who benefits. But when we're talking about deformed desires, it's really the social order that benefits because it keeps itself going, because women come to prefer things that keep it going. They involve deception about what you truly want. They can threaten your autonomy. And when you satisfy them, they can, and it's usually a sneaky way they do this, they contribute to women's oppression. Okay, and then lastly was this idea of the physician response. What should physicians do in these cases? Well, I would say they should seek to enhance bodily autonomy, so see if the patient is answerable to her moral convictions, try to get her to consider whether her desires are deformed, see whether her beliefs are contradictory. Does she really want this outcome? Does she prefer to die rather than be treated? Does she think males should be treated differently from females in favor if a male was in this position, and why? And then I would just urge that we recognize that there's a bigger picture at issue. If women aren't broadly granted the right to bodily autonomy, each time a case arises where it's an issue, it won't be seen as problematic to ignore it or to override it. It's just like snowballs. Like you feel like you can't go out there and say, no, I have a right to bodily autonomy, and why isn't it being respected? You just start to believe yourself that you don't have that right. So it's damaging to the women and even themselves, their own beliefs about what they have and can stand on. So I would urge respecting them. Okay, thanks.
Great, Anita. Thank you so much. We look forward to that book you're going to write about bodily autonomy and bodily integrity. So with that, let's shift to another philosophical perspective and philosophical work with Sarah.
Okay, thank you. Can you see my slides? Great, thank you very much. Thank you to all the organizers, and I'm so happy to be here with you, sharing some of my reflections on these issues, which are part of my broad, my broad research on obstetric violence, and that are very connected to the reflections that were presented now. I think it's many of the things I will be saying are things that are been that were said now in these two presentations, but in a different way, complementing. I want to say something about this issue of body autonomy that Anita talked about now, and I think it's interesting that we have also some other philosophies or school of philosophy where this is also heavily discussed, and sometimes it doesn't touch the ethical discussions, but it's, for example, in phenomenology, in existentialism, we have this idea that the body is our situation in the world. That's what the Beauvoir says, no? And so autonomy and bodiness are completely enmeshed, and we can almost not separate between them. I'm going to do some more like philosophical deconstruction of the things that have been presented to see more deeply of what are the problems that we are talking about. These concepts, autonomy, decisions, freedom of autonomy, it sounds, consent, sounds like concepts that are very, very fundamental in the discussion on ethics, on bioethics, on medical ethics, but sometimes we don't even know what we are speaking about, this, and these are very problematic concepts. For example, we can start by asking if is women's autonomy in patriarchy even possible? And I think Anita spoke about this now already. We are so enmeshed in tradition, in religion, in family, marriage, etc. But also, and I think this is an important point, also the medical institution is part of the patriarchal society and has these patriarchal values. I think it's very important to see that the medical institution is not, it doesn't have the birth view from above, no, to all these issues. That the medical institution is also part of these issues and these values, and this, of course, complicates things. One of the problems, the first problems I will mention about this, how it's possible in patriarchy to have autonomy, is this compliance. Yes, women in society, in patriarchal society, have been raised to socially compelled to comply, to ignore their own desires and to comply to those of others. Yes. So we have these girls, these little girls, and then young girls and women who come to these scenarios, to the hospital or to health scenarios. And they are, I mean, all their lives, they have been giving up their desires, and their, they don't even know sometimes what their desires are. No? So we find a very difficult situation where, and of course, paternalism is not the answer, but we find a very complicated, very complex situation where we have been raised to ignore our own desires and to comply to those of others. There are also power relations. And among doctors, for example, and caregivers and women, the power relations are very clear. Women are highly dependent on and respectful of doctors and caregivers' decisions, and they are enormously influenced by their opinions. I'm bringing all these because I think with the cases that AK presented to us, we might have this feeling that women come oppressed to these scenarios, and they come oppressed by families, by tradition, by religion, and the doctors can help them to take the good decisions or to see where autonomy is happening and how to give it place. But doctors are also part of this power that is influencing women. So it's not that women in front of the medical power are so free to make decisions, or that the medical power will lead them kindly, no, to this autonomy. Is much more problematic than this. Again, about body, we spoke about body autonomy. Our body is what we are, the place where from which we act in the world. But women are frequently seen and felt as objects. Also, their body is an object. It has been an object of consumption, of sexual pleasure. And of course, they come also to these scenarios feeling themselves many times, frequently, being objects rather than autonomous subjects. And they don't feel really entitled to make decisions about their bodies. And maybe sometimes also doctors don't see them as full subjects. So we know that medicalization is also, in great part, also objectification, and that many doctors and caregivers have learned to see women this way as well, not as fully subjects. And I think, of course, we have to emphasize that this is not done on purpose, intentionally, like doctors being bad, trying to take profit of, but it's how also they are also part of this patriarchal society, and they also have these beliefs on what women are. I just want to show you this this promotional material from the Israeli reality series Baby Boom, which is a reality series filming births in a hospital. So these are all real. This is a real doctor that I even was in a panel with, and this is the promotional material, and I think it's very, very revealing on what it says about women in birth, no? And we see the doctor and the baby with this halo, of course, and we see the husband, and we see the nurses, and we see legs, no? So we must be, I think, very careful of these scenes. So this is part of what we call obstetric violence, which is an institutional or structural violence, and it's also gender-based violence. It's an intersection of these two, and it's part of healthcare, of the reproductive healthcare, including care during pregnancy, pre-pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum. And I won't say so much about this, but I mean, we know this as the humanized treatment of birthing women, physical and emotional mistreatment, and above all, again, a transformation of women from body subjects to body objects in many different ways, in many different forms. This is also a very, I think, revealing picture on obstetric violence. I don't know if you can see. Yes, at least you have a healthy baby, which is frequently what we hear from, also from the medical institution and also from people around the woman. This is the most important thing, is that you are healthy and that you have this healthy baby, no? But sometimes the way that women come out of these births is so traumatic, also physically and emotionally, no? And that it's not all that matters, no? That we have this healthy baby and this healthy mother. Informed consent then is very complicated, and it's very, we need to ask if this is possible when many women cannot even imagine the possibility not to consent because of the things that I said, because compliance, power relations, objectifications, etc. So the problem of consent, yes. For example, I wrote this paper on vaginal examinations in childbirth, and I think it's an example that I can use to talk about how, for example, many women experience these examinations as sexual violence, as violence. But this is so, as AK said, this is so normative. This is something that we are so used to experience pain, to experience violence, that we lack even concepts allowing to understand these events as violent. And here we can speak about what is called hermeneutical injustice. Miranda Fricker coined this as part of the epistemic injustice she speaks about. And this is this impossibility, this lack of concepts to speak, to understand some experiences that we have, and that they have been normalized. So, for example, Diana Taylor, yes, she writes, with respect to sexual violence against women, the normative distinction at stake is not so much whether sexual violence is morally acceptable or reprehensible, but rather whether sexual violence is or is not properly violence at all. If simply being embodied as a woman is to ask for it, then any degree of male sexual attention directed at women cannot by definition be unwanted and hence a violation. This in turn calls into question whether such attention can be the sort of forcible and injurious action that constitutes violence. Yes, so asking about how is even this possible? Can we call this violence? And we have, for example, testimonies of bystanders of violence, of obstetric violence, that even when they don't have the concepts, the words to call it violence, they apprehend this as violence. And this is also a Butlerian distinction between comprehension and apprehension. She says sometimes we don't have the concepts to comprehend, to speak these experiences, but we feel them in our bodies. Yes, and I won't go through all this quote, but it's a quote from a doula experiencing obstetric violence to a patient, to a client of her. And she says what she felt in her body, yes, when she saw this. I felt frozen in place. I feel helpless. I feel fear, anger, and grief. There was nothing I can do. I knew my body was responding to something, yes, even if I wasn't the person. So this gives us clues on how also bystanders can sometimes feel things that afterwards need to be maybe to be conceptualized better in order to understand them. also speaking again about this normative, and also Anita spoke about this now when she talked about the grapes and the fox. Yes, women have spent decades politely ignoring their own discomfort and pain to give men maximal pleasure. They have gamely pursued love and sexual fulfillment despite tearing and bleeding and other symptoms of bad sex. They have worked in industries where the objectification and harassment was normalized, and chased love and sexual fulfillment despite painful conditions no one, especially not their doctors, took seriously. I wish we lived in a world that encouraged women to attend to their body's pain signals instead of powering through like endurance champs. It would be grand if women and men were taught to consider a woman's pains abnormal. Better still if we understood a woman's discomfort to be reason enough to cut a man's pleasure short. But those aren't actually the lessons society teaches, not even to entitled millennials. Another philosophically interesting aspect of the problem of consent is also exposed by Ellie Anderson in The Limits of Consent in Sexual Ethics. And she speaks about how consent presumes a level of self-knowledge that individuals often lack. Many of us are often ignorant of our own desires. So suggesting that we can know what we want the moment we are asked overlooks historically coded forms of behavior, the effects of past experiences, and the relative power of differing social locations. So this is also a very interesting, I think, aspect of this question of consent. How are we as subjects conformed? And we usually, when we use consent, we imagine this very stable subject who knows all the time what she wants, how she wants it, and can communicate it. And of course, things are much more volatile and these are much more fragmented. So also this is another problem. Of course, this doesn't mean that doctors know better than us in this aspect, no, but that this situation is, of course, complicated by this. And I think this is my last slide. What about what about the medical staff? Yes, and oh, I'm sorry. No, okay, about the medical staff and their autonomy. Yes, and medical practitioners, I write that medical practitioners, obstetricians and gynecologists, midwives and medical residents are themselves treated violently by violent systems and structures, which in turn make them act in violent ways towards patients. For example, a very young woman, a resident in obstetrics, told me a story, it's a real story, about being socially compelled to perform vaginal examinations on an anesthetized woman because all of her superiors were watching her, expecting her to do it. So I do not mean to say here in any way that the perpetrators of violence, yes, suffer from that violence in the same manner as the victims of that violence. But I do truly believe that just as in patriarchy, as patriarchy cannot be combated without also looking at the price that men pay for living in patriarchal systems, nor can obstetric violence be tackled without reflecting on the ways in which the perpetrators of this violence are themselves the victims of violent structures and trauma. And just one last thing, that maybe also autonomy is not the main problem. And this I argued, or I tried to argue in my, my paper, We Birth with Others, where I spoke about how autonomy has been one of the leading concepts when we speak about obstetric violence and what women want. And what we know from research is that this issue about who is making the decisions, or if my autonomy is respected, etc., is not the main issue, but rather who is caring for me and how they are caring for me, and if I am protected, if I am cared for, if I'm not, how do I feel if I not feel alone, if I don't feel abandoned in this scenario, no? This is very important for women. So I think it also connects with what Anita said about not on autonomy, no, but be respected as a person, no? And I think this caring and relations and this concept, feminist concept on relational autonomy, I think it's very important in this discussion too. And I think that's it for now, from my part. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for taking us deeper and bringing in things beyond sort of traditional ethics as well, like Anita did. I also want to thank you for the art and the images. It reminds us how powerfully that can communicate ethics as well. Also, I want to remind everyone in the audience that if you have questions for our panelists, please go ahead and submit those to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And with that, we are going to move to Michelle Sadler, our final panelist. Unfortunately, you can't be with us live today, but she is with us nonetheless by recording. And so we are ready to go there.
Hello, good morning. I'm Michelle Sadler. I imagine they have already introduced me. Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm very honored to be part of this forum, adding some thoughts and reflections from my field of expertise, which is medical anthropology. My presentation probably goes in depth into some of the topics discussed earlier, probably by Professor Sarah Cohen-Chabot. In thinking about the concept of autonomy, its roots, its applications in healthcare settings today. I will start by saying that in many cases, when thinking about ethical dilemmas in healthcare settings, we are confronted with cases of patients which come from other cultural backgrounds, from different cultural settings than ours, or from different understandings of health as the one that biomedicine has. And we are not so used to reflect on how the biomedical culture itself is as well a culture in its own, a cultural system with its own beliefs and practices. It is socially, it is culturally and historically constructed, as well as any other medical system or medical tradition. And the concepts we are using, of course, have been framed in a particular worldview or cosmovision. This applies to the concept of autonomy, what will be the center of my talk today. And a brief biographical note, but since I was an anthropology student in the 90s and doing fieldwork in maternity wards, I was involved in the Latin American movement towards the humanization of childbirth, in which autonomy, of course, was a protagonist concept in a quest for a person-centered and dignified care in health care settings in general, and especially in the arena of sexual reproductive care and in childbirth. In childbirth, we saw a growing recognition of the problem of abuse, disrespect, mistreatment in maternity wards, also referred to as obstetric violence in Latin American movement as a gendered violence against women. And we have seen International Health Agency calling to promote a positive birth experience and to, quote, returning birth to women and to families. This that has to be returned is in many cases framed as autonomy. And it is stated as such in health policies, guidelines, and much of the literature on sexual and reproductive rights and maternal health. As an example, I'd like to share you, these are some extracts of the Chilean Manual for Personalized Care in Childbirth from 2008, issued by the Ministry of Health. As you can see, autonomy is present all over the text, usually hand in hand with concepts such as empowerment, agency, decision-making, ability to choose. So one of the main principles here stated as the second principle is the autonomy of people, of persons in their health care. And if we go to the perinatal a guideline, again of the Chilean Ministry of Health. The concept is described or defined as the abilities that people possess to be independent and responsible, establishing the capacity to determine for themselves what is best for their sexual and reproductive lives. In other words, it implies respect for people's decisions and their self-determination. This concept of autonomy is the one that we will see most frequently in healthcare policies, guidelines, and it comes from a Western philosophical tradition. It was originally applied to self-ruling city-states in Greece, and then it was transferred as well to self-ruling agents. So it's mainly thought to connote independence and to reflect assumptions of individualism. The autonomous person would be one who can self-determine, self-legislate its own life, being able to make decisions in an independent way. And this is the understanding that has prevailed in biomedical ethics. As you well know, autonomy is one of 4 cornerstone principles in bioethics, together with non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice, as was outlined in the 1970s. The authors of these principles, Beauchamp and Childress, I quote, say that personal autonomy is at minimum self-rule that is free from both controlling interference by others and from limitations such as inadequate understanding that prevent meaningful choice. So, according to this kind of conception, a person's beliefs, desires, choices, decisions, etc. are autonomous when they fulfill certain procedural criteria, at least these 3 sets of criteria. Here I'm quoting Varelius. That they do not result from such things as compulsion and weakness of will, that they do not result from external influences as unreflected socialization, manipulation, coercion, that they are not false, inconsistent with each other, or uninformed about the matter without the person realizing this. But when we see these criteria, many questions arise. We could open a big debate, which we probably have already, but how can we define the quality of the will of a person? What would be an unreflected socialization? Which socialization is reflected and non-reflected? Which external influences could be called manipulative or not? How do we define what is false or what is not? And then what is for a person to be self-ruling, governed, legislated? What does this idea of own decisions mean? And here we can go probably to the discussions you already had today. What about all the contents, contradictory many times we have gone through in our socialization, hierarchies in medicine, in healthcare settings, power, gender, relations, ideologies, how we're framing our body processes, etc., etc., etc. It's very difficult to draw what is our own and what is not. And this brings us this brings me to my own. This is my PhD dissertation. These were some the questions that were driving me crazy studying these topics. And this was one of the objectives of my dissertation, was to see what was going on and what was happening with the application of this concept. As I showed you, health guidelines in maternal health guidelines in Chile are framed around this concept very strongly. So what was happening with this? After 15 years of implementation of such policies, were women being more autonomous? What was this? How was this being understood? And what I found and what I argued is that women were being left alone and their subordinate position was being reinforced under the slogan of regaining autonomy, which is paradoxical and contradictory, of course, but how was this happening? And the idea of autonomy, especially in the context of judicialization, how do you pronounce that? Judicialization of medicine and of obstetrics in particular. The concept was put into practice as a transference of responsibility, not in all cases, of course, but in many cases. So women and families are responsible for accessing the best information, preparing themselves, choosing adequately among the alternatives the system gives. And Chile, with a very neoliberalized, let's say, health system, gives options in the public and in the private health sector. So women and families have to navigate, understand how to navigate the system to achieve what they wish to. So there's this whole stress of choosing adequately, of navigating the system with all the contradictory information they're getting, in many cases mistrusting the health system due to negative prior health experiences or experiences of known people, then feeling guilty for not having chosen adequately or doing the right thing, being pointed at for not choosing adequately. A whole system, kind of a consumer market oriented health system where responsibility is transferred. So you are autonomous, you choose, this is taken to an extreme. For example, this is the webpage of a private clinic where women and families are offered to choose between the traditional birth, which is the medicalized, let's say, more interventionist model, and the natural birth program, where mothers can be true protagonists of birth, partners can participate, express their needs and preferences, blah, blah, blah. So what should be a right becomes an option. And this, of course, takes us to the fantastic book and idea and concepts brought by Anne-Marie Moll of the logic of choice and the logic of care. So she argues that what is prevailing in many health care contexts is this logic of choice, where there's this false idea that we have the freedom and right to choose between options according to our individual autonomous decisions. But, Moll argues, good care has little to do with patient choice and autonomy. It is not a matter of making well-argued individual decisions, but is something that grows out of collaborative attempts to construct care encounters. So if we go back to the idea of biomedicine being a cultural system, we can also say that bioethics are the product of a particular social, cultural, historical context. And if we think of the foundations of biomedicine within the principles of modern science, we, of course, know that modern science was founded by men, with the man as the norm for everything that is human. From the standpoint, the vision of masculine principles as superior to the feminine. So attributes such as individuality, objectivity, rationality, and emotional detachment were necessary for the advance of knowledge, in opposition to values ascribed or related symbolically to the feminine realm as relationality, subjectivity, irrationality, emotionality. One of the founders of the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge in 1660, is the oldest scientific society in the world, called to inaugurate the masculine birth of time, to detach the scientific ideal from emotions, and stated that truth has no possibility when affections and the feminine predominates. So could it be that these principles are embedded in bioethics? And this is a question that has been posed for long by feminist ethicists, arguing that the supposedly neutral perspective of traditional ethics is a specifically white male perspective, that traditional westernized ethical principles relying on individualism and agency, rationality and independence are masking power relations, dominance and structural inequalities, disregarding women's experiences and interests, and disrespecting women's capabilities for moral reflection. The critique to the individualized concept of autonomy points out that it is trapped in a narrow and disembodied definition of agency and of choice. Let's think of sexual and reproductive processes during our life cycle and childbirth in particular. When does a woman feel care? Which are common topics in caring experiences? And we will arrive to usually support, connectedness, company, not being left alone, feeling heard, feeling there, feeling a person, a whole person, integral person. As Sarah Cohen-Chabot has argued and probably mentioned earlier, in childbirth, women are in a state of embodied vulnerability in which interdependence and relationships among women and their lived bodies, among them and the others, are crucial. Rather than autonomy, it is such relations and support which are fundamental, and negative experiences arise when these are banned. In this line of argument, the subject is essentially constructed in relations. So this takes us to a different point of view, and we could think in terms of relational autonomy, which is a concept that is gaining territory in recent years. Relational conceptions of autonomy stress the role that relatedness plays in both persons' self-conceptions, relative to which autonomy must be defined, and the dynamics of deliberation and reasoning. They acknowledge that we are dependent on others to become our social selves. As Rachel Chadwick has pointed out, what emerges as important to the women are the types of affective energy flows and relationships that circulate in particular childbirth assemblages. Stories of pleasure and happiness involve the ability to represent embodied presence, agency, participation, and to be connected to others in affirmative, empathic ways. It is affective and communicative contexts that enable or inhibit the possibility of giving meaning to the experience of childbirth, as Learley has pointed out. Hence, care is not primarily shaped when making individual informed autonomous decisions, but when organizing collective care scenarios in practice. And this is the idea of logic of care posed by Anne-Marie Moll. And quoting Arthur Kleinman, caregiving is almost always a deeply interpersonal, relational practice that resonates with the most troubling preoccupations of both carer and sufferer about living, about self, and about dignity. This kind of approach would enable environments of collaboration instead of transferring responsibilities. It would avoid women being blamed by themselves or by others. It would allow lived, embodied experiences of being whole person subjects for all of those who participate in a birth assemblage. It would allow care to be understood as a collective experience of interdependence. Thank you very much.
And our shell in absentia. So let's bring Anita and Sarah back on. For a little bit of conversation. And let me just say a few words, see if I can pull up some commonalities across these wonderful presentations, just some things to keep in mind. Let's see if we can get Anita on first. There we go. So things to note, that also acknowledge patriarchy and sexism, right, as the relational soup that we're swimming in here, both in society and in medicine. And that's just not a sheer fact, it's a morally relevant fact, right, and affects the way we think about ethics. And Sarah and Michelle both name this kind of gender oppression as violence. One thing I want to say here is that our, and this is just related to the forum as a whole, that the focus here has really been on sort of cisgender women. And if in fact focusing more broadly in a range of genders, we'd be speaking about transgender add other forms of oppression and gender to this kind of intersectional conversation. Each of the panelists affirmed the need for a social way of thinking about persons and also about autonomy. And I think it's important to note that speakers spoke about different locations really of gender-based violence. So in some conversations, like society was the main source of this kind of patriarchy and violence, and others spoke of medicine or focused in on medicine, you know, as the context. for violence. And I want to just focus on medicine for just a second, or healthcare, and more, because part of the issue here seems to be that health rates, both in violence, in obstetric violence, for example, but resists it, aka this forum. And that's a fundamental ethical tension, right? That health has this obligation to care and to cure, or to reduce suffering at least, but also participate, in this kind of violence. And so I have a question for Sita, and this is kind of bringing it home to the question of and I want to think first in the longer term here. So it seems like what we're saying is that this harm done to women, this premature mortality and often unnecessary disability, that it's fundamentally a social problem as well as medical, but it's a structural problem. And that suggests that the solution is also structural, social, cultural. And we know that changing society, changing structures takes a long time. So the question I have for both of you right now is, in many countries, there are women's organizations actively resisting gender-based violence, including obstetric violence. And so the question is, do care have an ethical obligation to work with these social movements, right, to change values and norms in the name of improving women? So long-term thinking here. Is there an obligation on behalf of healthcare workers to do this work? And either Anita or Sarah, whoever would want first, love to hear from both of you.
You want to start, Anita?
Go ahead, Sarah.
Well, I think the answer is simple. I think the answer is yes. I think the answer is yes. I think there is an obligation an ethical obligation, I think, to work with these bodies, these organizations, which are making this very important work on spotting these problems and resisting and fighting against gender violence and discussing all these. The thing is that, of course, I know that there are problems with this. Of course, there are also practical problems, and there's also resistance, and I think it's normal that it is. Much of the discussions on obstetric violence, for example, are around the concept of violence, and this is a very interesting discussion, maybe for another time. But much of the discussions have been saying that doctors are very resistant to listen this concept, and they are antagonists to this concept, and maybe we should use something else. And sometimes what I say, and this is the short answer, is that the concept of structural violence, it's a really good concept that if doctors would understand as it should be, there will be showing much less resistance, but because this is not a behavioral violence, this is not a direct violence that they are performing because they want it, because they plan it. This is not this, no. These are structures that, as I said, they are also victims of, and that we are all part of. So I think we all have the responsibility to fight and to know these structures, and to have some education on these structures, and to resist them. And I think the thing is that we, as a society, I think, are responsible to teach doctors about this. I think these things have to be in the curricula of doctors. Doctors maybe sometimes, and I say doctors by saying all medical staff, no, but they don't have time many times, we know, to be activists and to engage in this, like maybe just AK, which is a superwoman or something. But I mean, usually doctors don't have this ability to be in all these fronts. So I think we are also responsible as a society to bring this knowledge and this activism to them, and to try to make alliances. This is difficult. Again, as I said, this shows a lot of resistance, but it's possible. We have been doing this, and yes, I mean, well, I will stop here now, but that will be my answer, my short answer. Yes.
I was going to actually say the opposite. No, they don't have an obligation because for exactly all the reasons you said that, look, it's normalized, and doctors might not be aware of this, and they also don't have a lot of time to join in on societies. But certainly, I think the experience of doctors, two things. One is the medical education that you mentioned, Sarah. I think this probably should be, really, really entrenched in medical education now. This is what's going on. And it's because it's so normalized, I think, they're maybe just getting overlooked, not really paying attention to it. But these good examples that you guys are all bringing up are ways of getting people to start thinking differently about those issues. Insofar as doctors working with these other social groups, it would be great if they would do that, so that these people are aware. Maybe they can reach out, the social groups can reach out to doctors and get a conversation going. I really don't know, the state of what's going on with those groups. Do they interact with each other? I'm in ivory tower doing philosophy most of the time. But yeah, obviously there's a problem, and obviously doctors can't, eradicate sexism, right? These big structural things are just like, really, really hard to do. But if you're aware of these things, and you're faced with a case like the 15-year-old, you can, just say some really blunt things to get everybody in that situation thinking about, what they're really doing. What are they doing? They're letting this woman, 15-year-old woman, go home and die, and the husband, or she's 15, she's got a husband, it's kind of weird. And he's just saying, oh, she can always have another baby. Like, he's not even getting it. No, she's going home to die, and you're letting her. And you could just be real blunt. And that's like a way of getting at what the bottom line is here, which is that all people have dignity, the same, men and women. And so you put it that way, well, it might fall on deaf ears, and I'm not sure what you do then. But I don't think doctors can change the social structure, but they're part of it. And the medical education can get them to recognize things that have, in their minds, become normalized. I just was listening to you, Sarah, talk about, just examinations and how that's violence. And wow, yeah, I never really thought about it because it's so normalized. I do feminism, and I'm like, just like, the way you described it made me go, yeah, you're right. It's a different way of looking at it. So to expect doctors that are really busy to be thinking of all this, I don't know, it has to be part of the medical education. Again, I think, like your kind of work and patients just telling them, hey, I don't like this, and I think a lot of women know that they're being harmed. I think they know what autonomy is for them deep down. This kind of treatment, something happened to them, this is wrong. They just know that, but they can't articulate it, or they're afraid, or they don't think they have the standing to do it. But they're thinking about it. So,
well, let me jump in here. We do have a physician who submitted a question kind of about this, and let me just share this. This is a physician, a general practitioner from Indonesia, who speaks to a particular, again, horrific case like we heard before. And what they say is, my question is, as healthcare workers, how should we react in this situation, and to what extent should we involve ourselves in the patient's process of making a decision? Would an early education regarding contraceptions for the husbands make a better outcome for the wives? And thank you. So Sarah or Anita, would you like to?
I think it's connected to something that I wanted to say now, also about Anita's words. I think these cases are very problematic. The cases presented by AK, and also the cases that this physician now presented, because it really makes us feel that in this case, the doctor there really can be the savior. I mean, and he can really be, or she can really be. She can really save lives here, and she can bring this perspective of respect for this person integrity, etc. But then we have this problem, no, of these doctors seeing themselves sometimes as too secure and too again, as Michelle said, too above culture, no. And the question is how to do it, how to do these conversations, how to present them, not to come from a paternalistic position, no, really to listen to the woman, to listen to the family. And of course, I mean, I can understand we are in face of so much injustice, that this is so painful, no, for these doctors, and I know it, but you need to understand that you have to be humble too, that you are part of this structure too, and that you have a lot of power on these people. I mean, apparently not on this husband, for example, who says, and this is also problematic now, because in the West we usually say people have too much power. Doctors have too much power on people who come to the hospitals, and evidently in these cases you don't have so much power. But yes, I think there are many questions there on how to do it, and how to do it respectfully, and how not to put yourself above culture and values when you are doing these interventions for the sake of these people.
We are very close to the end. Anita, if you had anything else to say to that, you sort of responded earlier, but
Yeah, I would just say, you know, the doctors should just know that first and foremost, that person in front of them is the patient, and they're trying to help that patient get the best health care. And, you know, if that means talking to someone else in the family and getting something moving, great. But you gotta do what's best for that person in front of you. That's your job, I would think. Yeah.
thank you. Thank you. And I'm guessing anything to share about this as well. And why don't we turn it back to her for that and wrap up.
Thank you so much. First of all, those are amazing talks. I have so much to chew on and to learn from. Thank you so much. And this recorded webinar will be on our website, so people can watch it again or send it to your friends and so forth. I just had a few comments. There's so many pieces as a medical provider that you're navigating. So there's the piece of the individual in front of you and what that particular issue is. So I will get to Dr. Ardita from Indonesia's very compelling question in just a sec. But there's also the issue of society, which is Charlene's question, which is what is our obligation to promote social justice in our society when we see injustices, when we see structural violence, when we see how the web of what has become normative impacts the lives of our patients, you know, in general and for the future. So there are these two different pieces, you know, what is our role and what is our obligation? Clearly, the easier answer is our obligation is to our individual patient, as Anita said. But I do agree that on some level, and that's the reason for this webinar, we also have an obligation to our society to have a voice and to call out when we see what we see. And we need to call it out and have conversation and discussion and think about solutions and change. So that's my idealism there. On the individual patient, this is very difficult. To Sarah's point, I come in with my own biases and my own assumptions about what I have agency as a physician to do. You know, I think one thing that's very clear, at least in North America, is this this careful informed consent discussion, what we call shared decision-making is sort of terminology that's currently used, where even if we disagree with the choices that our patients make, ultimately it's their choice. What was fascinating in the discussion about agency was that sometimes those choices are made with not enough information, you know, and that sometimes our patients are left high and dry. I mean, I see this as I'm primarily an oncologist. I take care of women with women's cancers, and to sometimes give to families and the patient a decision about cancer care, it's very, very difficult because they're not oncologists. They have a life-limiting disease that we're then saying, well, it's your choice. Yeah, you want a surgery? No, I mean, you know, we have to be guides, right? For just to focus on Dr. Ardita's patient who has had 7 children and whose husband is resistant to the idea of contraception, I completely agree with Anita. I think this is an opportunity to educate that husband and also to identify what are the power structures within that family. I mean, who is it that you have to bring in and ally with to try and get to a place where you're caring for that woman? You know, and part of it is there's health issues with multiple births. You know, there's poorer outcomes obstetrically when you have multiple births. So there's many ways to frame this and educate that husband and to find out what his particular fears are, you know, to come in sort of thinking the best about him, that clearly he's got 7 children. And what is it that is his resistance? So to sort of have that conversation. In the same way, getting back to the first case that sort of stimulated this whole journey, which was by Dr. Alamer in Saudi Arabia, her response was she feels that she can educate families in Saudi Arabia that actually it is not against Islam to have a pelvic exam on a single woman if it is to save their life, and that needs to be understood in the context about why the family says no. It's not that they want their daughter to die. It's that they have a sense that their moral Islamic faith prevents this. But in fact, there is a lot in their faith that allows this, and to educate within the sort of contextually within the particular norms of that culture to bring people along. So it's very complicated. I think it's very individualized. And to Sarah's point, ultimately, we all need humility. We are now at 9:30 in the United States. And so it is time to say goodbye. I would be delighted to receive any questions by email. And I think, can we put that in the chat, what my email is? Let me just put that in there. And just to say, I am so grateful to all of you for hanging out with us. So we'll say goodbye for now as soon as I put in my email.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
There we go. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
So good.
Thank you, Vic.
Bye for now.